in some ways, I will build very seamlessly on the fascinating discussion we've just had on climate action, the introduction by the minister earlier, by reflecting on this work we're doing at the World Economic Forum on strategic intelligence and connecting the dots, as it is put so aptly. And that is actually work we have started, or that emerged out of a community we have started to convene here 15 years ago, here in the UAE. Our network of global future councils that brings together over 1,000 experts from radically different backgrounds, perspectives, to come together to ideate, to develop ideas, solutions for some of these great global problems we're talking about here. And so it's quite appropriate to reflect about this in the context of the 15th anniversary of the National here. And if you reflect on this big collaborative effort we're undertaking with these experts coming together, bridging various different boundaries of sectors, disciplines of thought, then in a way you could position what you could call one of the defining paradoxes of our time, which is that on the one hand, as we've just discussed in the discussion on climate change, we have a great majority of people around the world that see and identify with the need for radical action, for collaboration, for greater collaboration, for a more sustainable future. But at the same time, we also seem to become more and more radical in defining our own little boxes in these environments. And there's an even greater majority of people that feels that it should be up to everyone to work out their own sets of principles to define their decisions. So it's an us versus them, defining sort of our priorities and our little domains, rather than coming together behind shared narratives, shared principles that can guide our future actions. And so the paradox is, we're of course more connected, we are pushing the frontiers of science, we are safer, we are healthier, we're living longer, all the broad indicators of progress that are broadly true. But we're also more divided, it came up in the discussion just now, and we're more entrenched in our positions. And it's these divisions that are increasingly the impediment for making collective progress. And by the way, also the reason why the theme for our annual meeting in Davos earlier this year was cooperation in a fragmented world. And you could argue that the seeds and the signs of fragmentation are everywhere around us. They're in education, they're in business, in politics, in culture. They're enshrined in the way we educate along fiercely defended disciplinary boundaries. They're enshrined in our organizations, in the way we reward and progress people across organizations. Specialization and the division of labor are the principles of our modern industrial societies. And don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing against the purpose of the firm, of the modern bureaucracies, but I'm trying to explore why it is so difficult for us to step out of these entrenched perspectives. And it goes all the way to how our international institutions are set up, with specialized agencies looking after carefully delineated portfolios of responsibility, where often a lot of energy goes into demarcating the turf, rather than focusing on collective progress. And this, what I would call radical demarcation, is also present with us in our cultural environment. The minister mentioned it earlier this morning. You think about what modern recommendation engines do in feeding us choices that are defined by very precise characteristics that the algorithms determine for us. That's radical demarcation at exponential scale and powered by increasingly intelligent machines. And so, in a way, there's this discrepancy between the rigidity of our organizational, political, social systems, the maps, if you will, that focus on what's central, on what we should be paying attention to, and on the other hand, the complexity, the interactions, the emergent behavior of the issues we're facing with. And so you could argue that if you look at the landscape of issues we are discussing here, that we need to address, we need maps that actually help us change perspectives, that challenge some of these established systems, and that lay the foundations for the kinds of transformations we need and want to see in the world, and that were the focus of the discussion just before. And in a way, Buckminster Fuller, an innovator, inventor, and in a way a very early climate activist, said it best when he said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And one new model, an alternative representation, could be using the language of networks to express a more holistic way of thinking in systems. Because networks, unlike the organizational charts or the maps of our traditional times, are relational by nature. They enshrine different perspectives by nature. They put the focus on the complexities of the interactions we face rather than reducing or simplifying them. And importantly, they put emphasis on what you could call the strategic periphery that is so often ignored or deprioritized in traditional linear or hierarchical ways of thinking. And because we wanted to enshrine this way, this connected way of thinking in our work, in the way we articulate issues, in the way we convene communities, we developed this system of what we call transformation maps. So that people and experts that may be working on health and healthcare intuitively think about, let's say, the future of work as part of their considerations of how to make progress on health and healthcare. Or that stakeholders in, let's say, the real estate industry, and we'll talk about spatial connectivity in the next session, that stakeholders in the real estate industry learn intuitively to look at the world from the perspective of climate scientists or advocates of civic participation, let's say, or indeed advocates of social justice. So learning this translational, connected thinking as an intuitive way of operating. And even the process alone of establishing this effort, which is an effort we undertake with universities, think tanks, international organizations around the world, this collaborative effort itself helps change perspectives and build new connections. But let me also give you an example of how we use this process, this methodology, to work with specific communities. And just recently, we gathered the chief strategy officers from our partner companies from over 20 different industry sectors. And by using this method, this networked way of thinking about their issues, intuitively, they gravitated not towards demarcating the specificities of their specific industries, but rather at identifying common challenges where they may have an opportunity to come together and learn and progress issues collectively. So for example, thriving with exponential AI and learning how to build processes into our ways of corporate governance that ensure the kind of guardrails that Mina and the minister were talking about earlier this morning. Or indeed, to unite for the green economy, as we just talked about in the previous panel, and learning how the energy transition really percolates into changes in every single sector, in every single industry, and requires a transformation in each of these areas. And another interesting element coming out of this discussion was embracing the over 50 workforce. A lot of industries face an exodus of talent, actually, as a whole segment of the workforce is moving towards retirement age, but at the same time, we face a population that is living longer and working longer, so a great opportunity, actually, to bring in skills from that generation. Or indeed, moving towards collaborative data sharing rather than holding on to data ownership. That was another realization of this group, that there's actually now much greater value in sharing data in an ecosystem rather than carefully protecting proprietary data in a small segment of a sector. And so looking at the opportunities and the needs for data policy to evolve to enable these kinds of shared values across industries, across sectors. And so, in a way, this is just one example of how this change in perspectives can change our predisposition to collaborate. But I hope it's also an illustration of why we feel this is so important for fostering collaboration in a fragmented world. And certainly, it is an approach that gives people agency. Because just like the world around us, networks are in constant evolution. They are not stable. They need to evolve. And so that means that our maps can, and indeed should be, continually redrawn. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stephan. I saw your transformation maps years ago and was overwhelmed by the amount of information, but then also how all those connections can actually come together to give you clarity. So I wanted to ask you to follow up on some of what you were talking about. I mean, we have compounded and connected crises. We keep hearing about wicked problems, complex problems. And so if you are thinking in this interconnected way, how then do you move forward? Like, what's the next step? So we have this realization, we have access to the maps, let's say, then what do we do?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mina. Thank you for asking it. So how do you translate this now into action? Well, the first step is really to acknowledge that we're facing complex systems. Now, in fact, we're facing overlapping complex systems, multiple complex systems. And what does that mean? What is the characteristic? The characteristic of complex problems or complex systems is that behavior is emergent. It cannot be controlled or indeed steered through central command. And so the first step is really acknowledging a certain strategic humility, which is difficult to acknowledge, but which is really a strategic realization that complex systems can be nudged, can be moved into a positive outcome if you have a clear understanding of the interactions of the different players. So it means sharpening that understanding of the interactions to find leverage points to intervene, to nudge the system into the desired direction. Now, the tragedy is that often by failing to understand that we're dealing with complex systems, by simplifying, by proposing simple solutions, often we accentuate the negative behavior of complex systems rather than encouraging a more positive outcome. And that's really how you could also summarize the discussion on the climate panel as well.
One of the other characteristics of the modern era is unpredictability. You can't predict in the same way that you could before certain trends. And you know, I laugh, our last forum that we put together was 5 years ago, hiatus of 3 years due to COVID. But 5 years ago, our forum was called the Future Forum, and we talked about everything except pandemics. And then, of course, we came to a realization that we should have probably had a huge session on a global health catastrophe that could hit. So how do you handle unpredictability? Because if you're building these models, then something could put a spanner in the works.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the same point of strategic humility. I think it requires a certain humility to acknowledge that we cannot perfectly foresee and track the developments of issues. You know, we publish every year a report on the global risk landscape based on surveying the landscape of what is top of mind for executives around the world, and you know, have networks like the Global Future Councils that I mentioned that focus on some of these unanticipated issues and connections. But I think accepting that strategic humility, that there will be unforeseen directions. The minister talked about this when talking about the trajectory of artificial intelligence. That's the first and most important point. And then, of course, building the kind of organizational resilience to deal with multiple different directions. And I think that comes back to the point that I tried to draw out in the presentation earlier about how we need to go very deep into organizations and even the educational system in teaching people to deal with an uncertain and evolving environment.
And it requires taking risks, because you will have a hypothesis or a theory based on either these networks or, you know, other people's experience, but your own organization or your own country will be facing different circumstances. So how do you mitigate risk, or how much risk should one be willing to take? I
guess, you know, the answer is it depends on the context. Now, mitigating risk is understanding risk and sharpening that awareness. I think one aspect that we focus on in our work is that often, whether you look at risk or define a longer-term strategy, the problem we see is defining the universe of your business environment or organizational environment in too narrow terms, right? By looking just as the immediate interactions and ignoring what I call the strategic periphery, so domains that are related that may not be immediately obvious why they matter to you in your organization, but actually that will be the drivers of fundamental change and transformation or risk. And so branching out into these related domains, understanding developments, whether that's in the discussion earlier when the minister mentioned the early skepticism about the pace of technological developments, AI, right? It was right for organizations early on to lay the foundations for how to embrace the exponential developments that we're seeing now in artificial intelligence, right? So all that to say, there are ways of mitigating risk by casting a much wider perspective, and that's really the focus when looking at organizational resilience to risk.
So one of the things that Catherine mentioned in the session that just preceded us was some of those voices that could help you cast a wider net are not in boardrooms, are not in decision making, and partly because you need a certain level of experience and you need a certain level of seniority to get there. So how do you, if you're advising an organization, let's say, ensure that there are those voices, but also have enough experience, understanding of the particular industry organization?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it goes back to organizational design and formats of participation, really. And I think that is often now, whether it's in the business domain or in the political domain, that's often overlooked. I think that's one of the other things that we can collectively do to strengthen resilience or our future preparedness is focus on formats that bring voices to the table. They are in every organization, in every community. You have that diversity, but often we are not very creative about the formats of how we even conduct conversations, how we build formats for large-scale participation. We have examples in working with companies that have started, for example, to open up their traditional strategy and risk sessions to a very open, participatory survey of all staff levels, which is something often quite hard and unintuitive in a way for organizations to do. But I think focusing and developing new formats for participation that have that focus on inclusion at the heart, I think that's the task that requires quite a lot of creativity.
So I'm going to open the floor for you. Ask Stephan questions or prod him on particular complex problems and how he would approach them. But before I do that, I want to ask you a question about multilateralism, because one of the things on the political stage, but also on the government stage, is that you have this complexity, but you need countries to work together. On the flip side, everybody agrees that our multilateral systems are at best challenged, and others would argue broken and not fit for purpose for where we are today. So how does this sort of thinking, this sort of strategic analysis, how can that help deal with these multilateral, old-style roadblocks?
Yeah, I think it's a similar perspective that is needed in the sense of a pragmatic focus on collaboration where possible, and also I would argue sharpening a sense of that you could explain with a scientific reference to the way quantum physicists think. If you think about quantum computing, is a breakthrough in compute because unlike traditional bits that are either 0 or 1s, qubits are a superposition of 0s and 1s at the same time. And so my analogy there in that sort of thinking into the multilateral space, I think we need to be much more comfortable with that simultaneous presence of agreement and disagreement, in thinking in pragmatic constellations of where progress can be made, and a very sharp understanding of the constellations of players that can have influence and leverage on progressing the outcome in what are complex constellations of actors in the multilateral system. So,
a very diplomatic response.
Well, it's a realistic response, I would say.
But is it possible? I mean, to get these constellation of actors to come together, or does it have to be specific to a particular issue?
Well, it's partly what we are doing at the World Economic Forum, is trying to bring the right stakeholders, and again, with a lens of mapping and understanding the dynamics at play to progress on the climate agenda in very specific domains, for example, and bringing the right constellations of actors together. And I think that is possible. It requires creativity. It requires a mindset that does not think in zeros and ones. I think that is what I wanted to underpin here, right? Is that mindset of looking at the world as zeros and one, as linear divisions, demarcating our positions is the impediment to making progress. And it's possible to step out of that. Yes, it requires, though, a lot more energy and creativity to move people along.
So, are there any questions from the floor? We do have indicate to me, please, if you're going to ask a question, just identify yourself. Okay.
Good morning. I come from the scientific world that studies all matters beyond our Earth. And so I'd like to be provocative and present to you a couple of challenges that we talk about in our world and ask you how you think the world would react to these. So suppose tomorrow we were to discover intelligent life beyond the Earth, which is perfectly feasible, and then say on Monday we were to discover an asteroid on a collision course with the Earth that was going to hit us in 20 years and would wipe out all life on the Earth. How would we react to those challenges?
Easy question for you.
It's a great question because it makes me think, you could say the pandemic we lived through was, it didn't come from outer space, but it was such a collective crisis that we went through. Now, I would say two things. I'm a social scientist, so you always look at possible different pathways. But one thing we did learn through the pandemic, I feel, collectively, is that there is a better understanding in all parts of society of what a complex system is and what how vulnerable, in a way, the collective and the collective well-being we have is. And of course, the scenarios that you're mentioning, sir, are in a way that existential moment for everyone to realize the common humanity, just at a greater scale, you could argue. Now, if you want to look at the positive outcome, to me, what makes me positive in the sense of having gone through such an existential experience with the pandemic is that there is a heightened awareness and I think a heightened urgency in governments and other organizations to prepare for these kind of vulnerabilities and build a better preparedness. And you would hope that in a case like this, the best energies get channeled. Now, we of course also saw that doesn't always hold true, and the honest answer is I don't know how we would react, but you would hope that these kind of catalytic moments, and again, the The minister talked about it with reference to technology this morning. I think he mentioned these moments of the show of force are the moments where we learn, our organizations, our political institutions learn how to deal with that. And I would argue to some extent that learning did take place in the pandemic. And you would hope that a similar learning curve would happen at much faster pace faced with such existential questions that you raised, sir.
Just to the point of learning, I mean, is about how we train ourselves to think and how we train our organizations then to act, or the teams that we work with. And so how do you get that either training or discipline to maintain that wider thinking when you're focused razor sharp on your day-to-day, the short-term day-to-day problem?
Yeah, you know what I find fascinating as a parent is that for children it's very intuitive to think in systems, in networks, in very broad terms. In a way, we socialize them into silos, and so it's really a question of organizational learning. Often the structures in organizations are not geared towards collective learning and towards embracing a more holistic reality, right, where the structures we build actually hold us back in allowing for that collective learning to take place. So I think that is what really requires dedicated attention and a constant trigger in a way, because naturally organizational dynamics tend to move into silos.
Okay, any other questions? There's a gentleman there, and okay, so we'll take one question.
I would like to pick up on your question about governments learning, because so the UAE here happens to sit where you have different nationalities, and it's a neutral country, and then you have the geopolitics playing at hand, and there is, you know, the Western idea of how to protect the environment, and then there's the Eastern approach of how to protecting the environment. Do you think there is a hope that maybe people actually start hearing each other and working towards that common agenda of protecting the globe, and maybe here being the platform to push for that?
I do think so. I do think so. And if you look at some of the data I referenced, some of that at the beginning of my presentation, but also if you look at surveys of young people, we do surveys of our communities of young leaders and change makers. There is a clear realization of the importance of making radical changes for a more sustainable future. And so I do think there is, particularly in the younger generation, a very clear awareness of that. And coming back to the point about learning, a lot of learning actually is generational learnings. New generations have a very different experience, and that is ultimately what does make me hopeful, because it's people that make institutions, and the deepest learning happens at that generational base. So the next generation of people will shape very different institutions and organizations. So that's why I would answer yes.
We have a question here at the front.
Thank you. I hope you agree that we live at a time of unprecedented change. I mean, we've talked about climate change, we talked about technology. We have seen radical changes in the demography of the world. the health crisis, food crisis in parts of the world, an economic crisis perhaps coming on with a debt. The interaction of these crises together makes things very difficult to predict for the future. How do we make ourselves better prepared to be able to understand that interaction between the demographic, the health, the climate, the political, the geopolitical crisis that we're dealing with at the same time?
Yes, that's precisely the point of shifting perspectives. I think my point is that we still have too much representation, and it goes from how we tell the stories in the media, how we then internalize and deal with these issues at various organizational levels. I think that shift in perspective needs to take place fundamentally, from education to media to organizations, because it is the reality of the issues we face. And that means we cannot develop solutions to these things in silos, right? But the fact is that a lot of the fabric of our organizations, politically, economically, socially, are still characterized in this way. So it goes back to me to that process of learning a different language, a language of connectivity. I think I commend you, therefore, Mina, on actually making that the theme here, because it is, I think, the defining issue of our time is learning that language of connectivity, and not just talking about it, but actually what it means to practice that in organizations, in education, in the way we find solutions collectively. And I think that requires a very different set of skills. I'm very optimistic, by the way, for the next generation, also because we teach different skills. I'm a social scientist. In my training, I had no significant training on, hard sciences or data science. Or nowadays, it's hard to be a university graduate, even in the social science, without having pursued basic training in data science and computer science and so on. And that does start to change perspectives.
And the opposite is also true, right? So for the hard scientists to also think about
absolutely,
what is considered
yes.
soft skills,
Absolutely.
but actually essential for
Absolutely. But that is starting to take shape, and we're educating differently. It's not universal, but it is starting to take place, and I think this is the answer to your question. We need to learn to not just speak the language of connectivity, but actually practice it in our organization.
So we have 1 minute before we have to wrap up the session, but there was a question here. Did you still want to ask the question? Just take a question.
You referred to creation of ecosystems for sharing proprietary data. From an R&D perspective, proprietary information processes technologies are something we hold very close as institutions. How can we encourage and incentivize the sharing or creation of an ecosystem, as you mentioned?
Yeah, look, there's enough evidence out there that there's great value in and shared value that can be created in spurring innovation and creating more value by open data, open science. I think this is ultimately something that either, as was mentioned in the previous panel, people see the effects, so you need to show and lead with examples. or it needs to be mandated. I mean, in the European Union, for example, research grants increasingly require that the results are published in open science, in open access journals. And so I think that realization of realizing greater value through sharing data is absolutely key.
So, to close our session, if we assume that those in the audience and those watching us are convinced that yes, this is absolutely the way I must go, what would be one thing you would ask them to start doing immediately to think in this more open perspective way? One thing.
I'm going to say, I'm going to say, start drawing the maps that you see of your environment and start to discuss it with the people around you, so that you actually start a process of dialogue, of surfacing the interactions that you see with others and starting that reconciliation. I think that is an important step, that dialogue in the process. That's also what I emphasize, that even the process itself on taking academic stakeholders on that journey of mapping interactions in a networked way, that's the learning process in itself. And so, yes, the recommendation would be to start that by drawing and discussing what you draw.
Okay, so Monday morning to my colleagues from the National, we're going to be drawing maps. All right, thank you so much, Stephan, for your time and for your insights. Thank you.